Carpathian Mountains did not care about the war being fought in their shadow. They had stood for millennia, indifferent to the creatures that carved their castles into limestone cliffs and buried their dead in frozen earth. They had watched empires rise and collapse, had felt the tremors of battles fought by things that should not exist, and they had remained silent through all of it. Tonight, they would witness something new. The ship entered the atmosphere at 2:47 a.m., traveling at a velocity that should have vaporized it. It didn't. The hull, a living metal alloy grown rather than forged, black as a collapsed star, absorbed the friction heat and redistributed it across the ship's surface in rippling waves of orange and violet that lit the underside of the cloud cover like a second dawn. To the 3 Lycan scouts positioned on the ridge above Varhegi, it looked like a meteor. To the vampire patrol moving through the pine forest below, it looked like an omen. To the thermal satellite operated by the Antigen Corporation's Eastern European division, it looked like nothing at all. Because whatever the ship was made of, it didn't exist on any electromagnetic spectrum their instruments could read. It hit the eastern slope of the mountain range at an angle, so not a crash so much as a controlled catastrophe. A calculated impact that tore a kilometer-long scar through rock and ancient pine before coming to rest in a shallow ravine 4 miles north of the abandoned fortification. The vampires called Isaac Hold. The impact shook windows in villages 40 kilometers away. It triggered 3 minor avalanches. It killed everything within 200 meters of the impact corridor instantly, not from fire or explosion, but from the shockwave alone. And then the hatch opened. Steam rolled out first. Pressurized atmosphere venting into the cold Carpathian air, carrying with it the smell of something organic and alien, a musk that had no name in any human language, something between copper and ozone, and the deep jungle rot of a world with 3 times Earth's humidity. The ramp extended, and the figure that descended it moved with the unhurried confidence of a creature that had never, in its entire evolutionary history, needed to be afraid of what waited in the dark. It stood 2 meters 30 at the shoulder, and that was without the helmet. Mandibles framed a face that existed entirely outside human aesthetics, not monstrous, simply other, built for a different set of imperatives. The biohelmet locked into place with a pneumatic hiss, and the Yautja's vision shifted through 4 modes in the span of a breath. Thermal, electromagnetic, low light, and ultraviolet, cataloging the new environment with the methodical efficiency of a machine and the hunger of something very much alive. The mountains registered cold. The sky registered empty. The distant infrastructure of human civilization registered as irrelevant background noise. But there, 2 kilometers northeast, moving through the pines with the liquid speed of things that had long since discarded the limitations of human muscle, 6 heat signatures that burned wrong, too cold for humans, too fast for animals, moving in tactical formation with the deliberate geometry of trained soldiers. And 3 kilometers south, cresting the ridgeline with the heavy, lumbering confidence of things that knew they were the apex predators of their world. 3 signatures burning almost too hot, bodies running at temperatures that suggested metabolic processes operating far beyond biological baseline. The Yautja stood at the base of its ruined ship and looked at the mountains and felt something it had not felt in 11 hunts across 6 worlds. Genuine interest. This was not a world of soft prey. The evidence was immediate and unambiguous. 2 separate species, both operating at superhuman parameters, both moving with military discipline through terrain that would have been impassable for anything merely human. The ship's passive scanners, still functional despite the impact, had already begun compiling atmospheric and biological data. The gravity was correct. The oxygen content was acceptable. The temperature was cold but manageable. And the prey, because that was what they were, that was what everything was until proven otherwise. The prey was extraordinary. The Yautja reached back and activated its cloaking device. The air around it shimmered once, like heat haze over summer asphalt. And then it was gone. Not hidden, absent. The light simply declined to acknowledge it. It moved northeast, toward the cold signatures. Because cold was unusual and unusual was interesting. And in 11 hunts across 6 worlds, the most interesting prey had always been worth the most. The pine forest closed around the space where it had been, and the mountains kept their silence. And 2 kilometers away, the vampire patrol continued moving through the dark with the total confidence of creatures who believed, after 4 centuries of war with the Lycans, that they had already met everything this world could threaten them with. They were wrong. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The first vampire to die never saw it coming. She was a century-old death dealer named Erzsébet, fast enough to catch bullets, strong enough to overturn armored vehicles. And she was dead before the sound of her own spine snapping had finished traveling the length of her body. The patrol stopped. 6 heads turned, 6 sets of eyes. Pale blue, luminescent in the dark, pupils dilated to capture every available photon. Scanned the forest with the enhanced perception of beings who had spent centuries hunting things that didn't want to be found. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The mountains watched. The pines stood still. And somewhere in the dark between the trees, something that had crossed the void between stars to hunt the most dangerous prey in the known universe began to understand that it had finally, after 11 hunts and a lifetime of searching, found exactly what it was looking for. Erzsébet's body hit the frozen ground, and the patrol scattered into defensive positions with the practiced precision of soldiers who had survived centuries of ambush. They moved without sound, without command, communicating through the subtle frequency modulations that vampires used when words were too slow. A biological radio built into their physiology over generations of warfare, operating just below the threshold of human hearing. Within 4 seconds of the kill, they had established a perimeter 30 meters in diameter, backs to the trees, weapons raised, eyes cutting through the darkness with supernatural clarity. They saw nothing. Soren, the patrol commander, was 212 years old. He had fought in the Ottoman campaigns, had survived the Purge of Cordova, had personally executed 3 Lycan alphas during Lucian's rebellion. He had never, in 2 centuries of warfare, encountered a kill that left no trace signature, no scent, no sound, and no thermal bloom. Erzsébet's neck had been broken with a force that his experienced eye estimated at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 kilograms of applied pressure. A Lycan kill by the physics of it. But the scent profile was wrong. The forest smelled of pine resin, frozen earth, Erzsébet's cooling blood, and something else. Something that had no category in his extensive internal catalog of threats. Metallic, organic, foreign in a way that bypassed description and went straight to instinct. His instinct said, leave. His training said, establish the threat before withdrawal. He trusted his training. He had trusted it for 2 centuries. He raised one fist, the signal for absolute stillness, and activated the ultraviolet lamp built into his tactical vest, flooding the immediate area with the same UV radiation that their ammunition was designed to deliver from the inside. The trees lit up in pale blue-white light. Shadows carved themselves into sharp geometry. And for just a moment, less than a second, the duration of a single heartbeat. He saw it. Not the predator itself. The cloaking technology was too sophisticated for that. But the UV light caught the displacement field at exactly the wrong angle, revealing the ghost of an outline. 2 meters 30 of something that stood like a predator stands, weight forward, perfectly balanced, and utterly still among the moving shadows. It was there for the span of a blink, and then it shifted, and the outline dissolved back into visual noise. Soren had time to think. It's been watching us decide what to do. Then it moved. The speed was not vampire speed. It was different. A controlled explosive burst rather than the liquid flowing motion that vampires used. More like a Lycan charge, but without the Lycan's reliance on mass and momentum. It came from the left, and Soren threw himself right on pure reflex, and the plasma caster discharged over his shoulder with a sound like compressed lightning and turned the tree behind him into a column of superheated vapor. The shock wave threw him 4 meters. He landed in a roll and came up firing, SIG P226 loaded with UV rounds, standard patrol ammunition, emptying the magazine into the space where the thermal bloom had appeared, tracking the trajectory of the shot, on leading the target the way you lead a moving mark. The rounds hit something. He heard the impact, a sharp metallic clatter, rounds deflecting off a surface that was neither flesh nor conventional body armor. Whatever it was wearing, it wasn't vulnerable to UV radiation, and it wasn't penetrable by 9mm rounds moving at standard velocity. 2 more vampires died in the next 6 seconds. Yautja went down when the smart disc took her across the throat, a weapon none of them had seen before. A spinning blade that moved with self-correcting trajectory adjustments, banking around her evasive movement as though it understood what evasion looked like. Kristoff was lifted off the ground by something that grabbed him mid-leap, used his own momentum against him, and drove him into a pine trunk with enough force to shatter the trunk and Kristoff's sternum simultaneously. 3 dead, and 3 remaining. Soren ran the tactical calculation in the time it took to reload, a calculation built from 2 centuries of combat experience, and reached a conclusion he had never reached before in 2 centuries of combat experience. We cannot fight what we cannot see. Withdraw, he said, at the vampire frequency, and the remaining 3 members of his patrol didn't question it. They ran, not in panic, but in the controlled full-speed retreat of soldiers executing a tactical withdrawal, moving at 60 kilometers per hour through the pine forest, vaulting frozen streams and deadfall without breaking stride. The predator let them go. This was not mercy. The Yautja had no particular concept of mercy as a gift given to the undeserving. This was calculation, the same cold arithmetic that governed every hunt. 3 of the cold-blooded creatures lay dead. The remaining 3 were fleeing toward what the ship's passive scanners had already identified as a significant structural presence 4 kilometers northeast. Stone, steel, reinforced concrete beneath a centuries-old exterior. The electromagnetic signature of modern security infrastructure hiding inside a medieval shell. Following them would reveal the nest, and a nest meant numbers, and numbers meant the hunt was only beginning. It retrieved the smart disc from where it had embedded itself in a frozen oak 20 meters downrange, the weapon returning to its magnetic anchor point on the gauntlet with a familiar weight. It stood over Erzsébet's body and looked at her with the biohelmet's electromagnetic mode, reading the biological architecture of her, the cellular structure that was both dead and not dead, the absence of a functioning heartbeat combined with the clear evidence of complex metabolic activity. Anna took a trophy, not the skull, not yet. She hadn't earned that. A single talon, severed cleanly, cataloged and stored. A preliminary specimen, an opening data point. It looked northeast, toward the retreating heat signatures and the hidden fortress beyond. And then it looked south, where the 3 burning hot signatures had stopped moving. They were no longer cresting the ridge, or they had gone still. The stillness of things that had heard the plasma discharge and were now doing what predators do when they hear another predator make a kill on their territory. They were deciding whether to investigate or wait. The Yautja's mandibles spread in the expression that, in Yautja culture, carried the weight of anticipation. It turned south. The burning hot ones had heard the shot and hadn't run. That was relevant data. That was, in the cold arithmetic of the hunt, or something approaching, promising. It moved through the dark toward the ridge, and behind it, the pine forest settled back into silence, and 3 dead vampires cooled slowly into the frozen earth of the Lycans on the ridge were not scouts in any conventional sense. Marius had stopped sending conventional scouts into the northern territories 3 weeks ago, after the vampires had started deploying death dealers in 6-person tactical formations rather than the standard 4. What he sent instead were hunters. Lycans who had been in the field so long that the boundary between their human and wolf states had worn thin, creatures who could shift partial aspects of their transformation at will, who could drop their core temperature to near hypothermic levels to defeat vampire thermal detection, who could read a forest the way a scholar reads a page. The 3 on the ridge were named Barak, Sylvester, and a female the pack called Verus, Red, for reasons that had nothing to do with her hair. They had heard the plasma discharge from 2 kilometers away and identified it correctly as neither vampire nor Lycan in origin, which was the kind of information that demanded investigation regardless of the personal risk calculation. Barak had been in the process of shifting to full transformation when the sound reached them. The sharp crack hiss of a directed energy weapon, a sound none of them had heard outside of Antigen's compound during the raid 2 years prior, and even then the signature had been different. This was cleaner, more powerful, the kind of discharge that suggested a weapon built for a specific purpose rather than adapted from something else. They spread across the ridge in a loose triangle, Verus taking the point, and moved south through the tree line with the ground-eating lope of partial shifted Lycans, knuckles brushing the frozen earth, spines lengthened, and muscles redistributed for 4-limbed movement, while the brain remained human operational. In this state, they were faster than humans by a factor of 8, quieter than full transformation by a considerable margin, and their olfactory systems were operating at full Lycan capacity, which meant they smelled the alien musk from 400 meters out and stopped dead. Verus raised a closed fist. The triangle froze. The smell had no referent. She had cataloged hundreds of scents in 15 years of field operation. Vampire variants, human subtypes, animal populations across 6 countries, the chemical signatures of various weapons and explosives, and the particular metallic sweetness of Lycan blood versus vampire ichor. This smell fit none of her categories. It was organic, definitely biological in origin, not chemical or mechanical. But the base notes were wrong in ways she couldn't articulate beyond wrong. Too complex and too layered, like something that had evolved on a different set of base proteins. She signaled, "Unknown biological, extreme caution." Barak signaled back. Vampire casualties downslope, 3 confirmed dead. They looked at each other in the dark, communicating in the way that Lycans who had hunted together for years communicated. Not telepathically, nothing so elegant, but through the accumulated shorthand of shared experience and survival. 3 vampire death dealers dead. Unknown biological origin. Directed energy weapon. The arithmetic was unusual, but not complicated. Something had arrived in the Carpathians tonight that was neither vampire nor Lycan, and had immediately begun killing vampires. In Lycan strategic calculus, that was at minimum worth observing and at maximum worth exploiting. They moved downslope, slower now, triangulating on the scent. And Veras was the first to see the displacement shimmer. Not because her eyes were better than Barak's, but because she was looking at the negative space between the trees rather than the trees themselves. A hunting technique she'd developed against vampire cloaking units 3 years prior. The shimmer was there, and then not there. Moving south along the base of the ridge with a patience that she recognized instinctively as the patience of something that hunted for reasons beyond hunger. It wasn't running. It wasn't retreating. It was tracking. Barak went full transformation without a signal. She heard his bones restructure in the dark, the wet crack and grind of a body rewriting its own architecture, 400 pounds of muscle and rage assembling itself in the span of 3 seconds. She didn't stop him. A full Lycan transformation generated a heat signature that was essentially a biological flare. And if the unknown creature used thermal vision, which, given the directed energy weapon, there was a reasonable assumption, then Barak had just announced their position with considerable clarity. She was right. The displacement shimmer stopped moving. Then it turned. What happened next lasted 11 seconds and felt considerably longer. Barak charged because Barak had been in the field long enough that his threat response had been simplified down to 2 options, charge or retreat, and he had stopped retreating from anything 3 years ago. He covered 40 meters in the first 2 seconds, 400 pounds moving at the speed of a large motorcycle. And he was genuinely impressive. Genuinely terrifying, the kind of force that had ended vampire patrol careers abruptly and without appeal. The predator sidestepped. Not away, through, closing the gap rather than opening it, letting Barak's momentum become a liability, and the combi stick extended to full length in the space between 1 second and the next. A 2-meter hafted blade that caught Barak across the chest with enough force to redirect his charge without stopping it, spinning him 90 degrees and sending him into a deadfall that collapsed under 400 pounds of transformed Lycan, with a sound like a small building coming down. Sylvester hit the predator from the right simultaneously. A coordinated attack, the kind of pincer movement that Marius's hunters practiced until it was reflex. And this time, the predator took the hit. The Sylvester's transformed fist connected with the biohelmet, and the impact registered in the Yautja's tactical assessment as significant. Not damaging, but significant. These burning hot creatures hit with genuine force. The predator caught Sylvester's follow-up strike, held the transformed Lycan's wrist in a grip that stopped 400 pounds of supernatural momentum, and then simply looked at him. The biohelmet's lenses shifted through vision modes, thermal, electromagnetic, on ultraviolet, cataloging the creature in its grip with the focused attention of something building a comprehensive threat assessment. Sylvester snarled. The predator's mandibles spread. Then Veros did something neither of them expected. She stepped out of the tree line, still in human form, hands visible, and she spoke, not to the creature holding Sylvester, but at it, and in the tone of voice that wasn't a plea and wasn't a command, but was the tone of someone who had decided that intelligence was the only weapon left worth deploying. "Let him go," she said, "and I'll show you where the vampires sleep." The forest went quiet. Even Barak, hauling himself out of the collapsed deadfall with the slow dignity of a creature who refused to acknowledge that it had just been redirected like a shopping trolley, went still, and the predator held Sylvester for 3 more seconds. Then it released him. It didn't lower the combi stick, but it didn't advance either. It stood in the dark between the trees, cloaking disengaged now, either damaged by Sylvester's strike or deliberately deactivated. And for the first time in the encounter, the Lycans could see what they were dealing with. Barak made a sound that in a human would have been a sharp intake of breath. Sylvester, Milov rubbing his wrist where 4 distinct pressure marks had already begun bruising through transformed hide, stared with the expression of a creature recalibrating its entire understanding of the threat landscape. Varus kept her eyes on the biohelmet's lenses and did not look away, because she understood, on a level below conscious thought, that looking away right now would be the last thing she ever did. The predator looked at her for a long time. Then it made a sound. Low, clicking, but complex, that none of them could interpret, but that carried the unmistakable weight of a decision being made. It gestured northeast, toward the vampire fortress. Voros nodded once and began walking, and the 3 Lycans and the thing from beyond the sky moved through the Carpathian dark together, and none of them were allies, and all of them understood that perfectly. Isak Hold had been built in the 14th century by a Hungarian nobleman who understood, even then, that the best fortifications were the ones that didn't look like fortifications. From the outside, it presented as a moderately preserved medieval castle. The kind of crumbling romantic ruin that appeared on regional tourism websites, alongside photographs of fog and adjectives like haunting and atmospheric. The curtain walls were genuine 14th century stonework, weathered and moss-covered and thoroughly convincing. The gatehouse was authentic. The collapsed south tower was authentic. The 40 centimeters of reinforced steel composite armor plating installed behind every stone facade was not authentic, and neither were the UV floodlight arrays concealed in the battlements, or the silver nitrate sprinkler system threaded through the interior ceiling infrastructure, or the 12 death dealers currently stationed in the Great Hall, listening to Soren describe what had killed 3 members of his patrol. Soren was not a dramatic individual. 2 centuries of warfare had compressed his communication style down to operational essentials. Threat parameters, casualty data, tactical implications, recommended response. He described the encounter with the flat precision of a soldier filing an after-action report, and the room listened with the focused silence of vampires who had learned over centuries that underestimating a new threat was how you ended up as a cautionary tale told to younger vampires. Elder Vadim sat at the head of the long oak table and did not move while Soren spoke. He was the eldest vampire in the Eastern European Coven network at 640 years, which was not old by the standards of the original elders, but was old enough that his stillness had a geological quality to it. The stillness of something that had watched enough things happen to understand that reacting quickly and reacting correctly were frequently incompatible. He had survived the collapse of Victor's authority, the chaos of Marcus's awakening, the systematic dismantling of the Coven hierarchy that Selene's existence had precipitated. He had survived by being patient and by being precise and by never, in 640 years, allowing himself the luxury of assuming he understood a situation before he had all the relevant data. "Show me the talon," he said, when Soren finished. Soren placed the severed talon on the table. It was 12 centimeters long, slightly curved, a dark gray-black that was neither bone nor keratin, but something in between, denser than either, being with a structural grain that ran lengthwise in parallel lines visible to vampire eyes under the hall's lighting. Vadim looked at it without touching it. His chief scientist, a 200-year-old vampire named Ilka, who had spent the last century doing exactly the kind of work that the Ministry of Magic would have considered unconscionable and the Antigen Corporation would have paid enormously for, leaned over the table and examined it with a loupe that she wore on a chain around her neck. "Not terrestrial," she said after 30 seconds. "The protein structure is entirely outside any biological catalog I have. The density suggests a calcium analog skeletal system operating under significantly higher gravity than Earth standard. She looked up at Vadim. Whatever this creature is, it did not evolve here. That much was evident from the energy weapon discharge, Vadim said. What I want to know is whether it can be killed, whether it can be controlled, and whether its technology can be extracted and replicated. The hall absorbed this in silence. Soren, who had been the one to stand 40 meters from the thing in question while it turned one of his patrol's trees into superheated vapor, had opinions about the first question that he kept carefully off his face. Vadim made his decision with the efficiency of someone who had been making operational decisions for 6 centuries, or he dispatched 4 teams. Not 6-person patrol formations, but 12-person tactical units, the kind of force concentration the coven reserved for Lycan alpha hunts. 2 teams to establish a perimeter around the crash site and secure whatever technology remained in the vessel. 1 team to recover Erdsebet and the others and extract biological samples before the cold destroyed cellular integrity. 1 team, his best, not led by a death dealer named Kira, who had been operating in the field for 90 years and had never lost a target, to locate the creature and assess capture feasibility. He did not say kill it. He said assess capture feasibility, and everyone in the room understood the distinction, and Kira understood it better than anyone because she had been present for the conversation 3 years ago in which Vadim had described the Coven's strategic situation with the kind of honesty that leaders rarely permitted themselves. The elders were gone. The old power structures were rubble. The Lycans were reorganizing under new leadership. And the vampires needed an advantage that went beyond silver nitrate and UV rounds and centuries of accumulated tactical experience. They needed something that changed the fundamental parameters of the conflict. A creature from beyond the stars, armed with technology that could kill death dealers without being detected, was either the greatest threat the Coven had encountered since Marcus or the most significant strategic asset in 4 centuries of war. Vadim intended to find out which. What he did not know, what none of them knew, because the information had died with Erzsébet's patrol, was that the creature they were preparing to hunt had already been to the crash site, had already retrieved 3 additional weapons from the ship's armory that it hadn't been carrying during the initial patrol encounter, and was currently 400 meters from Isaac Hold's northern wall, crouched in the pine forest with its biohelmet running a full structural analysis of the fortification. The electromagnetic scan was thorough and took 90 seconds. It revealed the steel composite armor behind the stone facade, the UV array positions in the battlements, the internal layout of the Great Hall, the distribution of cold signature biological entities within. 41 concentrated in 3 areas, each with a significant cluster in the ground-level central chamber and smaller groups in what the scan interpreted as upper-level sleeping quarters and a lower-level space that the temperature differential suggested was a detention area. 41 cold signature entities, plus whatever residual technology the Coven had installed, plus fortifications designed to stop things that moved fast and hit hard. And the Predator ran the tactical assessment and reached a conclusion that in human terms would have translated as, not yet. Not because it was afraid. The Yautja concept of fear was sufficiently different from the human version that the word barely applied. But because 41 prepared combatants in a hardened position was not a hunt. It was a siege, and sieges were not hunts. And what the Yautja had come here to conduct was a hunt. It needed the vampires in the open. It needed them reactive rather than prepared. It needed, in the coldest possible tactical terms, to give them a reason to come out. It pulled back from the northern wall and moved west, circling the fortification at 400 meters, maintaining the scan, cataloging entry and exit points, identifying patrol patterns from the movement signatures visible through the electromagnetic overlay, and as it moved, it became aware, gradually, and then with sudden clarity, that it was not the only thing circling Isaac Hold tonight. The 3 Lycans had not followed it to the fortress. That had been an exchange of information, not an alliance, and the Predator had understood that perfectly. But something else was moving in the western tree line, something that had the cold blood signature of a vampire, but was moving alone, without tactical formation, without the electronic emissions of coven standard equipment. One cold signature, moving with the careful, deliberate patience of someone who was also conducting a reconnaissance. The Predator adjusted its heading. The lone vampire was 400 meters west, moving parallel to the fortress wall, and it was good, genuinely good, operating with a fieldcraft sophistication that the patrol had not demonstrated, keeping to the thermal shadows created by the rock outcroppings where the castle wall met the mountain slope, and minimizing its own electromagnetic signature with the practiced economy of someone who had learned, through experience rather than instruction, exactly how much presence was too much. It was, the Predator assessed, the most tactically capable entity it had encountered since landing. It changed course and followed, and the mountains kept their silence. And inside Isaac Hold, Vadim dispatched his teams into the dark, and none of them knew that the thing they were hunting was currently more interested in the lone figure moving through the western shadows than in anything their fortification contained. The lone vampire was Selene. She had been in the Carpathians for 6 days, operating without coven support, without the network of safe houses and supply caches that death dealers depended on in extended field operations, living out of a military rucksack and the accumulated survival knowledge of 2 centuries of warfare. She had come back to the mountains not because she had anywhere else to go. The coven structures that had defined her existence for most of those 2 centuries were gone or compromised or actively hunting her. But because the mountains were where the war had started, and she had learned long ago that when everything became unclear, you returned to the beginning and looked at it again with new eyes. She had seen the impact from 12 kilometers away. Dinah had watched the entry trail burn across the underside of the cloud cover and done the immediate tactical calculation. Not a missile, wrong trajectory and deceleration profile. Not atmospheric re-entry of human origin debris. Wrong size, and the electromagnetic signature was completely absent from her helmet sensors where it should have been present. She had moved toward it immediately, not because she was reckless, but because unknown variables in an already volatile operational environment were more dangerous ignored than investigated. And because 2 centuries of being the thing that went toward danger rather than away from it had built neural pathways that made the alternative feel like a kind of dying. She had reached the impact corridor 40 minutes after the crash and spent 20 minutes reading the site with the methodical patience of someone who had investigated a great many scenes of violence and understood that the evidence always told the story if you were willing to listen carefully enough. The scar in the mountainside, the organic metallic alloy of the hull material, unlike anything in her considerable experience of both human and supernatural metallurgy. The interior of the vessel. She had entered through the open hatch, moving through spaces that were built for something larger than a human, and laid out according to a spatial logic that was functional rather than aesthetic, utilitarian in the way that military equipment is utilitarian, every surface and angle optimized for a specific purpose. The trophy wall had stopped her. She had stood in front of it for a long time. Skulls, dozens of them, mounted with a care and deliberateness that spoke of ritual significance, not decoration, not intimidation display, but record-keeping, proof. Each skull represented a kill, and the kills represented a catalog of biological diversity that spanned, she estimated, at least a dozen distinct species. She recognized 3. Human, clearly, a large feline that might have been a mutated variant of something terrestrial, and one that made her go very still, because it had the elongated cranial structure and orbital socket configuration of a vampire, and it was old. The mounting hardware had oxidized in a way that suggested decades at minimum, and the skull itself had the particular brittleness of very old vampire bone, long separated from the regenerative blood chemistry that normally preserved it. Something had hunted vampires before, and kept the skull. She had left the ship and begun circling the fortress because Vadim's response to the crash would be immediate, and because she needed to understand what she was dealing with before Vadim got his hands on it. Vadim was not a bad leader by the operational standards of vampire coven management, but his strategic imagination was bounded by 6 centuries of the same conflict, and she had watched enough capable commanders make catastrophic decisions by trying to weaponize things they didn't understand to know that whatever had arrived tonight needed to be assessed by someone whose first instinct wasn't, "How do I use this against the Lycans?" She was good enough at fieldcraft that she had almost convinced herself she wasn't being followed. Almost. As the sensation arrived not as a sound or a sight, but as a pressure. The specific quality of attention that highly capable predators generated when they were focused on something. A disturbance in the ambient threat landscape that 2 centuries of surviving things that wanted to kill her had made her sensitive to at a level below conscious processing. She stopped moving, pressed herself into the shadow of a rock outcropping where the castle wall met the mountain slope, and went completely still, dropping her body temperature through the vampire's conscious thermoregulation ability, reducing her electromagnetic signature by powering down every piece of active equipment on her person: helmet sensors, tactical vest electronics, the small encrypted communicator she carried out of habit rather than operational necessity. She became, to the greatest extent her nature allowed, nothing. The forest around her was silent for 11 seconds, and then the cloaking field disengaged 4 meters to her left, and the predator was simply there, present, fully visible, crouched at her eye level on the rock face with the relaxed certainty of something that had never needed the concealment in the first place, that had dropped it now as a deliberate communicative act rather than a tactical necessity. The biohelmet's lenses were directed at her with an attention that she recognized, as with a jolt of something between professional respect and visceral unease as assessment. Not threat display, not the prelude to an attack. Assessment. The focused, evaluative attention of something deciding what category she belonged in. She looked back at it, without moving. The trophy wall was very present in her mind. The vampire skull. The deliberateness of the mounting. The implication of a hunter that crossed distances she couldn't calculate to find prey worthy of the effort. "But you followed me from the crash site," she said. Not a question. The predator made no sound. The lenses shifted. She caught the micro-adjustment, a change in the optical configuration that suggested it was cycling through vision modes, examining her in spectra she couldn't perceive. "You let Soren's patrol go," she said. 3 dead, 3 retreating. You could have taken all 6. She kept her voice level. When the tone she used when delivering tactical assessments to audiences, she needed to remain calm. You wanted them to run back to the fortress. You wanted to know where it was. The mandibles moved. Not the aggressive spread she had seen described in Soren's report. Something subtler. A fractional adjustment that carried no human analog, but that her pattern recognition read, tentatively, as acknowledgement. She had spent 2 centuries among creatures whose communication operated on frequencies and registers that humans couldn't access. She understood, better than most, that intelligence expressed itself in forms that had nothing to do with language. What was in front of her was intelligent. Deeply, dangerously, operationally intelligent. Not in the way that Lycans were intelligent, tactical, and adaptive within a known framework, but in the way that suggested a framework so different from anything she'd encountered that she was essentially working from first principles. "There are 41 vampires in that fortress," she said. "Vadim will send teams after you within the hour. 12 to a team, his best people, armed for something they've never fought before." She paused. "That's not a hunt. That's an execution squad." The predator looked at her for a long time. The forest was very quiet. 3 kilometers east, she could hear, at the edge of vampire auditory range, the sound of Vadim's first team moving out through the fortress's eastern gate. Boots on frozen ground, the soft mechanical sounds of weapons being checked and readied. She made a decision. Not the kind of decision that felt good or clean or straightforward. The kind of decision that felt like the least wrong option available in a landscape where all the options had significant costs attached. "I'm not your enemy," she said. "And I'm not asking for an alliance." She held the predator's gaze steadily. "I'm telling you that in approximately 40 minutes, you're going to have 4 teams of 12 death dealers trying to take you alive, and that the only person in these mountains who understands what Vadim is actually planning to do with you is standing right here." The biohelmet's lenses were steady on her face. The plasma caster on its shoulder mount tracked fractionally, not toward her, she noted, but past her, a northeast, in the direction of the emerging patrol sounds. "I've seen your trophy wall," she said quietly. "I know what you are. I know what this is." She met the lenses without flinching. "So, does that skull on your wall tell you whether I'm worth listening to? Or do we do this the hard way?" The mountains held their breath. Inside Isaac Hold, Vadim watched his teams deploy on the fortress's security monitors and permitted himself the measured satisfaction of a commander who had lived long enough to know that patience was the most lethal weapon in any arsenal. In the western tree line, 4 meters apart, a death dealer and something that had hunted across the void between stars looked at each other in the dark and conducted the oldest negotiation in the history of violence. The predator lowered the combistic 2 degrees, and it was not much, but it was something. They didn't speak again. Language wasn't the medium available to them, and both understood this without requiring it to be established. What they had instead was proximity. The specific charged proximity of 2 apex predators who had independently reached the conclusion that the other was not, at this moment, the primary problem, and the shared operational reality of 48 death dealers moving through the Carpathian dark in 4 teams, enclosing a perimeter that would take approximately 35 minutes to complete at standard tactical pace. Selene moved first, west along the base of the mountain slope, away from the fortress and away from the approaching teams. And the predator followed at a distance of 20 meters that it maintained with a consistency that told her it had chosen the distance deliberately. Not close enough to suggest submission, not far enough to suggest disengagement. Most the distance of something that was making a provisional calculation and reserving the right to revise it. She led them to a position she had identified during her initial reconnaissance, a natural rock formation 2 kilometers west of the fortress, where a collapsed section of the original medieval outer wall had created a debris field that provided both cover and elevated sight lines across the approach corridor that Vadim's teams would have to use. She had found it because she thought like a tactician and always identified fallback positions before she needed them. She suspected the predator had already identified it from its own reconnaissance, but was allowing her the operational gesture of leading, which told her something useful about how it navigated relationships with entities it hadn't yet fully categorized. She settled into a firing position behind a section of collapsed battlement and pulled her helmet sensor suite back online, and running it at minimum power to reduce electromagnetic signature. The display populated with the movement data of Vadim's teams, 4 blue clusters, moving with the disciplined spacing of veterans, fanning out in the search pattern she'd anticipated. Professional, thorough, completely unaware that the asset they were attempting to acquire was currently 2 kilometers west of their search origin point, watching them deploy. The Predator crouched on the rock formation above her, 4 meters up, and she could hear, just barely, the soft, active sound of its biohelmet running its own sensor sweep. After 30 seconds, it made a low sound, a single clicking note, and she looked up to find it gesturing. 2 fingers extended toward the easternmost team, then a thumb drawn across the palm, a gesture that required no translation. "Not yet," she said quietly. The mandibles adjusted. Impatience, maybe, or recalculation. "Vadim's teams aren't the problem I need you to understand," she said, keeping her voice below the threshold that would carry to the nearest patrol, which was 400 meters east and closing at standard pace. "The problem is what Vadim intends to do if his teams succeed. He's not trying to kill you. He's trying to capture you. There's a difference, and the difference matters." She watched the patrol through her helmet display and continued. "He has a scientist, Yautja. She's been working on Lycan vampire hybridization for the better part of a century, now trying to engineer a strain that combines vampire speed and Lycan regeneration without the incompatibilities that killed every previous attempt. She's very good." Selene paused. "What she could do with your biology, your technology, is something I don't want to think about carefully, because the conclusions aren't acceptable." The Predator was listening. She couldn't prove this in any conventional sense, but she had spent 2 centuries reading creatures whose attention operated differently from humans, and the quality of its stillness had changed. The shift from active tactical monitoring to something more focused, more internal. "A coven with your cloaking technology would end the war in 6 weeks, she said. "Not end it, win it. 40,000 Lycans, hunted by vampires they couldn't see, couldn't detect, couldn't fight. And Vadim isn't Victor. Victor believed in a balance, even if his methods were monstrous. Vadim believes in completion." She let that sit for a moment. "He will not stop at the Lycans." Above her, the Predator shifted its weight. The plasma caster mount rotated 15 degrees northeast and held. The eastern team had stopped moving. She checked her display. They had found something, were clustered around a position approximately 600 meters northeast, and she identified it after a moment as the location of the brief engagement between the Predator and Soren's patrol. They were reading the site, which would take time, and the information they extracted would be both accurate and incomplete in ways that would shape Vadim's tactical model incorrectly. Good. Incorrect models were useful. "I'm not asking you to help me," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I know what you are. You didn't come here to resolve a conflict that has nothing to do with your world." She looked up at the biohelmet's lenses, visible now as 2 faint amber points in the darkness above her. "But I think you came here to hunt. And I think you're running a calculation right now about which prey in these mountains is actually worth the effort." The amber points didn't move. "The Lycans want to use you as a weapon against the vampires. I watched them make that decision in real time when Vorus offered you the fortress location. They weren't helping you. They were directing you." She kept her voice flat, clinical. "Vadim wants to dissect you and wear your technology like armor. And I'm telling you that both of those outcomes are worse for you than anything else available. Because one ends with you in a specimen jar and the other ends with you as a guided missile that gets discarded when the war is over. She paused and looked back at the patrol display. You took a talon from Erzsébet, she said, not a skull, because she didn't earn it. She kept her eyes on the display. You've been here less than 3 hours, and you've already developed a threat taxonomy of this conflict. I know you have. Because you're still alive, and you didn't survive this long on 3 worlds by failing to understand your operational environment. The Predator dropped from the rock formation without sound, landing 4 meters to her left with the compressed spring precision of something that had spent a lifetime calibrating exactly how much force each movement required. It crouched at her level, and for the first time since the encounter began, she was looking at the biohelmet straight on rather than at an angle, and the amber lenses were 2 meters away and absolutely steady. It reached to its gauntlet and activated a projection. Small, holographic, the pale blue light of it cupped in the mountain dark. And the image that materialized above the gauntlet was a topographic rendering of the surrounding terrain. She recognized it immediately as a scan composite. The fortress and the mountain slopes, the tree lines, the patrol positions marked in 2 colors. 2 colors, not one. The Lycan positions, triangulated from earlier in the night, were marked separately from the vampire patrol clusters. It had been tracking both factions simultaneously since before she'd found it. Of course it had. You already know, she said. The projection shifted, zoomed to the fortress, penetrated the walls to show the interior layout with a resolution that told her its electromagnetic scan had been exceptionally thorough, and highlighted 3 specific locations inside Isaac Hold in a 3rd color. She studied them, extrapolating from her knowledge of the fortress's layout, and identified them after a moment as the Great Hall, Ilka's laboratory on the lower level, and the detention area in the sub-basement. The detention area was marked brightest. She looked at the projection for a long moment, and then looked at the amber lenses. There are humans down there, she said. Not a question. The Predator made a sound she hadn't heard it make before. Short, percussive, carrying a tonal quality that her pattern recognition processed as something between contempt and cold fury. The mandibles were fully extended, and she understood with a sudden clarity that rearranged several of her assumptions about what was driving the creature's decision-making. That the trophy wall on its ship was not simply a record of worthy kills. It was also a record of what happened to prey that couldn't fight back. And the Predator did not add those to its trophies. It remembered them differently. Inside Isaac Hold, Ilka was in her laboratory reviewing the biological data from Erzsébet's talon when Vadim's voice came through the internal communication system with the particular quality that she had learned. Over 2 centuries of working for him, he meant that operational parameters had shifted. Adjust your preparation protocols, Vadim said. We may be bringing back a live specimen. Ilka set down the talon and looked at it for a moment. And then she began clearing her largest examination table, and the detention area in the sub-basement remained exactly as it was. And outside in the Carpathian dark, something ancient and merciless from beyond the stars had just made a decision that had nothing to do with trophies. The first team Vadim sent back empty-handed arrived at the fortress gates at 4:15 a.m. The second team arrived 12 minutes later with 2 casualties. One death dealer with a plasma burn that had taken her left arm below the elbow, cleanly enough that vampire regeneration would handle it given time. And one who would not regenerate because the smart disc had found him in the dark between 2 trees, and the mathematics of what it had done to his cervical vertebrae were not compatible with continued biological function regardless of supernatural resilience. The third team didn't arrive at all. which told Vadim more than any after-action report could have. He stood at the Great Hall situation table and looked at the casualty data and did the arithmetic with the cold precision of someone who had been doing this arithmetic for 6 centuries. And the arithmetic produced a conclusion he didn't enjoy, but could not logically dispute. His 12-to-a-team tactical doctrine, built across centuries of warfare against Lycans and optimized for fighting things that were fast and strong and healed quickly. He was not producing adequate results against something that was fast and strong and healed quickly and couldn't be reliably detected and carried weapons that operated on principles his people had no counter-doctrine for. He needed new information. He called Soren. "Tell me again about the moment it stopped," Vadim said. "When you used the ultraviolet lamp, the outline you saw." Soren described it again with the same flat precision. The displacement field, the UV catch, the brief resolution of an outline before it shifted. Vadim listened and asked 3 questions, and then stood in silence for 90 seconds while the tactical implications assembled themselves in his mind with the methodical inevitability of a structure being built from components that had been lying on the ground waiting. "It has a camouflage system that UV light partially disrupts," he said finally. "Its weapon is a directed energy projector mounted on the shoulder, MATA, which means it requires line of sight and has a minimum activation distance. Soren survived because he was close enough that the targeting system couldn't depress far enough to acquire him accurately." He looked at the table. "It's tactically disciplined. It doesn't kill indiscriminately. It follows a selection logic." He paused, and it let 3 of Soren's patrol leave, which means it wanted us to know it was here. Ilka, who had come up from the laboratory when the second team returned, was standing at the table's edge with the focused attention of someone to whom dead bodies were primarily data. "The Talon material," she said. "The density and protein structure suggest an evolved predator. Not engineered, evolved. The weapon technology and the biology exist in the same organism, which means this species has had its technology long enough that the two have co-developed." She looked at Vadim. "Whatever world produced this creature, it produced it through genuine evolutionary pressure. Something was hunting it. Something significant. Or it was hunting something significant," Vadim said. The silence in the Great Hall had a particular quality. The silence of 40 vampires recalibrating threat assessments simultaneously. Vadim made 3 decisions in rapid succession. The way he made decisions when operational tempo demanded compression of the deliberation process. First, suspend active pursuit. The pursuit doctrine was producing casualties and intelligence simultaneously, which was an acceptable exchange rate for a known threat and an unacceptable one for an unknown. Second, activate the UV array across the entire fortification perimeter. Not as a weapon, as a detection system, flooding the approaches with the ultraviolet spectrum that partially resolved the creature's cloaking field. Third, offer terms. He wasn't certain the creature could receive or interpret terms, but it had demonstrated intelligence sufficient to run complex tactical operations and sufficient restraint to leave survivors when survivors served its purposes. Those 2 qualities together suggested a mind that could recognize the structure of negotiation, even if it had no framework for the specific protocols. He had Soren go to the eastern gate with a UV lamp and stand in the open and make no aggressive movement, which was the closest thing to a universal signal of non-hostile intent that Vadim could construct from available materials, and which cost nothing if it failed and potentially cost everything if the alternative was continued attrition of his death dealer roster against an enemy he couldn't see. What Vadim did not know was that the creature he was attempting to signal had been inside the fortress for 40 minutes, when it had entered through the collapsed section of the original medieval outer wall on the western face. a structural vulnerability that Vadim's renovation team had filled with rubble and mortar 3 years ago, but that the electromagnetic scan had identified as load-bearing compromise, meaning that the fill material could be removed from specific points without triggering the structural sensors that monitored the wall's integrity. The Predator had spent 8 minutes on precise, silent excavation of a passage 60 centimeters wide and 90 centimeters tall, small by its standards, adequate by necessity, and had been moving through the fortress's interior infrastructure since 3:50 a.m. The interior was everything the scan had suggested and several things it hadn't. The scan had shown layout and structural data, but not atmosphere. And the atmosphere of Isaac Hold was something that the Predator's olfactory system, sophisticated beyond any terrestrial biological equivalent, was processing with considerable attention. 400 years of vampire occupation had layered the stone with a palimpsest of biological signatures. Blood, old and recent. The chemical markers of supernatural metabolic processes. The sharp, clean smell of silver nitrate in the ceiling infrastructure. The specific cold organic scent of vampires in quantity, which was unlike anything in the Yautja's prior cataloging, but which the biohelmet's chemical analysis was rapidly building a threat profile for. It moved through the service passages that ran behind the Great Hall's walls, passages built in the 14th century for servants and updated in the 20th century for cabling and plumbing, now serving neither of those purposes but still structurally sound and, crucially, not monitored by the security system because they were too narrow for a Lycan in full transformation, and the fortress's threat doctrine had been built around Lycan infiltration as the primary concern. It found Ilka's laboratory on the lower level by following the smell. Chemical compounds, biological samples in various states of preservation, the particular antiseptic odor of a workspace that dealt regularly with things that rotted if you didn't manage them carefully. The laboratory door was reinforced steel with a biometric lock, which presented no meaningful obstacle once the Predator identified the door frame's structural weaknesses and applied approximately 400 kilograms of pressure to the specific point where the lock mechanism connected to the wall mounting. The door opened inward with a sound like a large book closing. Ilka was not inside. She had gone upstairs when the second team returned. Her workbenches were occupied by ongoing experiments that the Predator moved past without disturbing because destroying evidence without understanding it was tactically wasteful, until it reached the central examination table where a cleared space and the particular smell of recently moved equipment told it that this surface had been prepared for something. Recently, within the last 2 hours. It understood what the cleared table meant. The same intelligence that had read the tactical situation from Soren's patrol behavior, that had triangulated both faction positions from fragmentary evidence, that had run the capture versus kill probability calculation correctly enough to stay alive through 4 encounter cycles in a hostile environment. That intelligence looked at the cleared examination table and understood with complete clarity what Vadim intended to put on it. It left the laboratory and went deeper, following the sub-basement stairs that the scan had identified, and found the detention area behind a second reinforced door that opened the same way the first had. The smell here was different, human, recent, alive. 4 individuals in separate cells, all conscious, all registering on the thermal overlay as the burning hot signatures of living human biology that stood out in the cold blood fortress like candle flames in a dark room. The Predator stood in the doorway of the detention area and looked at the 4 humans and ran a categorical assessment that took approximately 3 seconds and produced a clear conclusion. Unarmed, no combat indicators, no threat profile. The fortress's blood supply, the cattle that Selene had described with the particular flatness of someone describing something they found intolerable. The Yautja code on this was not complicated. It did not require deliberation or calculation. An unarmed prey was not prey. Taking trophies from unarmed prey was not honor. It was the opposite of honor. And the opposite of honor was something the Yautja had a word for that translated, imperfectly, as corruption. It opened the cells, all four. The humans stared at it with the specific paralysis of people whose threat processing systems had encountered something so far outside their experiential framework that the normal fear response had simply failed to initialize. A young woman in the second cell found her voice first, not to scream, which was the response the predator had learned to expect from unarmed humans in distress, but to ask, in a shaking but functional voice, whether it was there to help them. The predator looked at her for a moment. Then it gestured. The universal grammar of follow me that apparently transcended species boundaries, or at least transcended them sufficiently that all four humans understood it and stood up. And it led them back up through the service passages, through the western wall breach and into the Carpathian dark, and the UV floodlights on the battlements searched the empty approaches, while Soren stood at the eastern gate with a lamp trying to signal something that was already gone. And Vadim's cleared examination table remained cleared, and the predator walked four humans through the frozen pine forest toward the tree line, where, based on its earlier reconnaissance, the nearest human settlement was 11 kilometers southwest. It stopped at the tree line and pointed southwest with a precision that suggested the direction was not approximate. The young woman from the second cell looked at the gesture and looked at the biohelmet's lenses and said, in the same shaking but functional voice, "Thank you." The predator made no sound. It watched them go. Four burning hot signatures moving southwest through the dark, diminishing on the thermal overlay. And then it turned back toward the fortress, and the mandibles spread. And what had begun as a hunt had become something with an additional dimension that the Yautja's honor code had always contained, but rarely had occasion to express this cleanly. Now the fortress could burn. Selene found the empty cells at 4:47 a.m. She had entered the fortress through the same western breach the predator had used. Finding it, not because she had followed the creature, but because she had identified the same structural vulnerability during her initial reconnaissance, and had been planning to use it herself before the encounter in the western tree line had rearranged her timeline. The breach was slightly wider than it had been in her reconnaissance notes, but the fill material removed with a precision that spoke of significant strength applied with unusual delicacy. And she had moved through it with the fluid economy of a death dealer who had been infiltrating fortified positions for the better part of 2 centuries. She had gone to the sub-basement first, because the humans were the most time-critical variable. Everything else in the fortress could be addressed in sequence. The humans could not be addressed later, because later, on Vadim's operational calculus, meant processed, cataloged, and consumed in whatever configuration best served the coven's current requirements. She had told herself she was going to the cells because the intelligence value of the humans as witnesses to the coven's internal operations was significant, and because leaving them constituted an unacceptable collateral outcome in any operational framework she was willing to operate within. She had not told herself the other reason, because the other reason was older than her tactical training and considerably less comfortable to examine. The cells were open and empty, all 4. The lock mechanisms on the doors were intact. The doors had been opened from the outside by something that had simply removed the wall mounting rather than engaging with the lock's biometric architecture. The smell in the corridor was unmistakable. The alien musk, present and recent, overlaid on the human biological signatures of 4 individuals who had been here within the last 30 minutes. She stood in the empty detention corridor for 4 seconds, which was a long time for her. And then she went back upstairs because the predator had done the thing she had been coming to do. and the calculus of the situation had shifted accordingly. She encountered the first death dealer on the second-floor corridor, a young vampire named Alexei, who had been stationed at the interior security post and who had the poor operational fortune to be coming around a corner at the precise moment that Selene was moving in the opposite direction, at the unhurried pace of someone who had decided that urgency was less useful than deliberateness. Alexei had his weapon up in the time it took most humans to register that they'd seen something, which was genuinely fast. And Selene had his weapon at his wrist, and him pressed against the corridor wall in the time it took Alexei to process that the weapon was no longer in his hand. She held him there, not hard enough to damage anything, firmly enough to make the cost-benefit analysis of resistance obvious, and looked at him with the expression she had developed over 2 centuries of conducting conversations where the other party had strong incentives to be less than fully honest. "Vadim's teams," she said. "How many have come back?" Alexei was young enough that his threat assessment was running several iterations behind the situation, still stuck on the initial intruder categorization and not yet processing the more nuanced intruder who was choosing not to hurt me data. "2, he said, and then appeared to be surprised at himself for answering. "Casualties?" "3 dead, 1 severe injury." He paused. "Yautja, a 3rd team is missing." "The creature took the 3rd team's patrol route," she said, not really to Alexei, running the tactical picture in her head. "It's been drawing your teams away from the fortress sequentially." She looked at him. "Where is Vadim right now?" "Great Hall," Alexei said. And then the more nuanced processing finally caught up, and he added, with the tone of someone who had realized they'd been answering questions they hadn't decided to answer. "Why are you—" "Because in approximately 15 minutes, this fortress is going to become very difficult to be inside," she said, and released his wrist and left him in the corridor. And he stood there for a moment with the expression of someone whose operational framework had been comprehensively disrupted before his training reasserted itself. And he began moving toward the nearest alarm station. She was already on the stairs. The Great Hall was exactly as she remembered it from the last time she had stood in it, 3 years ago, under circumstances that had ended with the coven's formal designation of her as a liability rather than an asset. A designation she had disputed not through appeal, but through survival. The long oak table, the tapestries on the walls, 14th century, depicting hunting scenes that had always struck her as having a different significance once you understood what lived in the castle. In the security displays showing the perimeter approaches in real time, currently showing Soren standing at the eastern gate with a UV lamp like a lighthouse keeper searching for a ship that had already passed. Vadim was standing at the table with Ilka and 4 senior death dealers. And he looked at Selene when she walked through the Great Hall's doors with the expression of a man who had prepared for many contingencies and found that the universe had produced one he hadn't specifically anticipated, but which his general framework could accommodate. "Selene," he said. The tone was the tone of someone who had moved past surprise directly into tactical assessment. "The humans in the sub-basement are gone," she said. She didn't stop moving, kept her pace even, covering the distance to the table at the speed that said, "I'm not threatening you, but I'm also not asking permission to approach." The creature released them within the last hour. Ilka's expression shifted, not surprise, calculation. "It assessed them as non-combatants," she said. "It has a code." "It has a code," Selene confirmed. "Which means your capture plan has a fundamental problem, because any code sophisticated enough to produce that behavior is sophisticated enough to find a specimen jar considerably less acceptable than combat." She reached the table and looked at Vadim directly. "It came inside, Vadim. While your teams were searching the perimeter, it was in this building." The silence in the great hall had a different quality now. Not the recalibration silence from earlier, but the specific silence of people understanding that the perimeter they believed they were maintaining had already been rendered theoretical. It didn't kill anyone inside, Vadim said. His voice was steady. It was the steadiness of a very old vampire who had survived long enough to understand that panic was a resource expenditure with negative returns. No, Selene said. It didn't. Because inside it found unarmed humans, and its code doesn't permit trophy taking from unarmed prey. She held his gaze. But the humans are gone now, which means the next time it comes inside, the calculus will be different. Vadim looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the calculation, the same calculation she had run in the western tree line, the same one the Lycans had run on the ridge, the same one everyone who had encountered this creature tonight had eventually been forced to run. What do you do with something that doesn't fit any category your doctrine was built for? You've spoken with it, Vadim said. It wasn't a question. I've communicated with it, she said, which was more accurate. Enough to understand that it came here to hunt, and that it will hunt what it determines is worth hunting, and that your attempt to capture it has moved it from assessing the environment to actively engaged. She paused. You've made yourself prey, Vadim. The moment you sent teams after it, you made yourself prey. Then what do you suggest? The question was genuine. She could hear it underneath the controlled delivery, the actual inquiry of a leader who had encountered the limit of his existing doctrine and was, however reluctantly, soliciting an alternative framework. Before she could answer, the UV perimeter array on the northern wall went offline. Then the eastern array. Then the western, not damaged. The system diagnostics on the security display showed clean shutdowns. Each array powered down individually in a sequence that moved around the fortress perimeter with the deliberate pacing of something that wanted the sequence to be observed. Everyone in the great hall watched the display. In 45 seconds, every UV array around Isaac Hold went dark. The fortress was blind. Ilka said very quietly, "It understands our systems." Soren, who had come back inside when the eastern array went down, said nothing. He stood at the edge of the hall with the expression of a 200-year-old soldier who had revised his threat assessment 3 times tonight and was now arriving at a 4th revision that he found deeply uncomfortable. Vadim looked at the dark display where the UV perimeter had been, and then he looked at Selene, and for the first time in 640 years of making decisions that other creatures had to live with, he said something she had not expected him to say. "Tell me what it wants," he said. Outside, the Carpathian Mountains stood in their ancient silence, and somewhere in the dark between the trees and the fortress walls, Ak the Predator crouched with 3 additional weapons retrieved from the ship's armory, and the plasma caster fully charged, and the biohelmet running target acquisition across all 41 cold signatures inside the fortress. And it was no longer assessing. It was ready. The answer to Vadim's question came not from Selene, but from the fortress itself. The northern wall breach happened at 5:03 a.m., not through the service passage the Predator had used before, but through the wall proper, a section of 14th century stonework and 21st century composite armor that came apart under focused plasma fire in a way that suggested the weapon had been specifically calibrated to the material composition, which meant the electromagnetic scan had provided not just structural data, but molecular density mapping accurate enough to identify the precise energy application required to open a 2-meter aperture without bringing down the surrounding architecture. It wasn't destruction. It was precision. The difference registered in the Great Hall as a deep, concussive thud followed by the sound of settling debris. and Vadim's security display, populated with breach alerts in the specific cold blue color that the system used for structural failures before the display went entirely dark, as something physically removed the power relay for the fortress's electronic infrastructure from whatever conduit it occupied inside the northern wall. The Great Hall ran on torchlight after that. Literal torchlight. The iron sconces that had been installed in the 14th century and never removed because vampires saw perfectly well by fire, and the aesthetic was authentic. The flames threw moving shadows across the tapestried walls and the long oak table and the faces of the death dealers taking positions around the room's perimeter. And Selene noted, with the part of her mind that never fully stopped doing tactical assessment regardless of circumstances, noted that the torchlight was going to create exactly the kind of visual noise that a cloaking field exploited most effectively. She said, "Nobody fire unless you can see a target." And several of Vadim's death dealers looked at her with the expression that Vadim's death dealers had been giving her for 3 years. And Vadim said, "Do what she says." And they did. Because Vadim's authority was the one constant that had survived every other structural collapse the coven had endured. And then the predator walked through the breach and decloaked in the corridor outside the Great Hall. And the sound it made as it crossed the threshold was the sound of something that had decided to be heard. It appeared in the Great Hall's doorway at full height, 2 meters 30, the biohelmet's lenses sweeping the room with the amber steadiness that Selene had come to read as operational focus rather than aggression. The plasma caster was active on its shoulder mount, tracking across the room in small, precise increments. The combo stick was extended. The smart disc was magnetically docked on the gauntlet, but not deployed. A distinction that she read immediately as intentional. It was showing them its weapons without using them, which in the grammar of what she had learned about this creature tonight meant, "I want you to understand what I'm choosing not to do." Nobody in the room moved. I've 40 vampires, and the specific silence of people who have been in enough combat to know that the wrong movement at the wrong moment is how rooms full of capable soldiers become rooms full of dead ones. Vadim stepped forward. One step deliberate, placing himself at the head of the table with the posture of someone formally representing a position rather than personally advancing a threat. He's 640 years of diplomatic context in his bearing. The recognition that how you stood in rooms like this wrote the first sentence of every negotiation that followed. "You came inside," he said. "You disabled our defenses. You released our..." He paused, selecting the word carefully. "Guests. And you are standing in my hall instead of burning it." He met the biohelmet's lenses with the directness of a man who had looked at things that wanted to kill him for 6 centuries and had learned that looking away was its own kind of concession. "What do you want?" The predator looked at him for a long moment. Then it looked at Selene. She understood. Not perfectly. There was no perfect understanding available in a communication framework this improvised. But sufficiently. "It wants what it came here for," she said. "It wants a hunt. A real one." She kept her voice steady. Not 40 vampires in a fortified position running capture doctrine. Not Lycan packs being directed like missiles. A hunt. Ilka, who had been standing at the table's edge with the focused attention of a scientist in the presence of data she desperately wanted to collect, and was restraining herself from attempting to collect, said quietly, "It wants us to fight it properly." "It wants the strongest you have," Selene said. "In the open, on its terms." Vadim was quiet for 4 seconds. She could see him running the calculation, the same one she had already run, the one that produced a conclusion she didn't like but couldn't argue with. Refusing meant a siege conducted by something that had already demonstrated it could enter and exit the fortress at will, disable their infrastructure without triggering their countermeasures, as in release secured assets from locked cells. Accepting meant committing his best death dealers to a combat engagement with a creature that had killed 6 of them tonight and taken no significant damage in return. Neither option was acceptable. The Predator was offering them the less unacceptable one. "Kira," Vadim said. The death dealer stepped forward from the wall. 90 years in the field. The best Vadim had, and by the only metric that mattered in the operational context they were currently occupying: survival. She was looking at the Predator with the expression of someone who had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for something that was actually worth the full application of what she was capable of. "And the Lycans," the Predator said. The sound stopped every vampire in the room cold. It was not language, not any language, but it was unmistakably communicative. A vocalization that carried the specific tonal structure of a statement rather than a threat display. Produced by a vocal apparatus that had clearly been listening to human speech patterns and had extracted sufficient structural information to produce something that operated in the same register without replicating the phonemic specifics. Selene understood it because she had been in communication with the creature long enough to have developed a rudimentary interpretive framework, and because what it had said was consistent with what she already knew about its tactical assessment of the night's events. "It wants both," she said. "Vampires and Lycans. Together." The silence that followed this had several layers. The tactical layer, the immediate operational question of how you coordinate with a faction you had been at war with for 4 centuries on a timeline measured in minutes. The historical layer, the weight of everything that had happened between these 2 species, the centuries of atrocity and counter-atrocity, the specific personal losses that lived in every vampire in this room and every Lycan on the mountain as permanently as their supernatural biology. And beneath both of those, the layer that Selene had been living in since Michael, since the hybrid question had cracked open every assumption the war had been built on. The question of whether the thing the 2 factions were fighting for was worth more than the thing they were fighting against. Vadim looked at her. She looked back at him. And then she took out the encrypted communicator that she carried out of habit rather than operational necessity. And she opened a channel that she had last used 14 months ago. And she said 2 words to the Lycan frequency that she knew Marius monitored. "The Ridge." Marius's voice came back after 6 seconds. 6 seconds that contained, she suspected, a very compressed version of the same calculation that Vadim had just run. "How long?" 20 minutes. Another pause. Then, "Voros said it fights clean." "It fights clean," she confirmed. The channel closed. She looked at the Predator, which had been monitoring the communication with the biohelmet's audio systems and had registered, she was certain, every word. Its mandibles adjusted in the fractional way she had been learning to read all night. And she placed this one, tentatively but with reasonable confidence, as something adjacent to satisfaction. And they moved out through the northern breach into the Carpathian dark. Kira and 4 death dealers from the fortress. Moving with the contained velocity of vampires who were choosing not to run at full speed, because running at full speed was a tactical commitment, and they were still orienting to an operational situation that had no precedent in their doctrine. The Predator moved ahead of them, cloaking disengaged, which she understood as a communicative act. "I am not hiding from you right now, and you should understand what that means about what comes next." The ridge was a natural amphitheater, a curved rock face above the tree line that created a space 300 meters across with clear sight lines in every direction and the mountain's bulk at its back. The Lycans arrived 4 minutes after the vampires, 7 of them, Marius at the front in partial transformation, Voros to his right, On Barak, somewhere in the tree line behind them, still moving with the careful dignity of something that had been redirected by a combistic earlier in the night and had not entirely forgiven the experience. The two factions stopped 20 meters apart on opposite sides of the ridge space, and the 4 centuries of history between them sat in that 20 meters like a physical presence, and nobody moved. The predator stepped into the center of the space. It looked at the vampires. It looked at the Lycans. It looked briefly at Selene, who was standing at the tree line's edge in the specific position of someone who had arranged something and was now stepping back from it, not retreating, not disengaging, but refusing to stand in the center of a thing she had helped create, because the center of this particular thing belonged to the participants. Then it activated every weapon simultaneously. The plasma caster charged with a sound like compressed thunder. The smart disc deployed and began its orbital pattern. The combistic extended to full length. The wrist blades emerged from the gauntlet housing with the clean mechanical precision of a weapon that had been designed by something that understood the aesthetics of combat as well as its function, and from a secondary housing on the opposite gauntlet, not a weapon she hadn't seen before. Something that fired concentrated net projectiles laced with a filament material that the biohelmet's earlier scan had apparently identified as capable of constraining both vampire and Lycan biology. It was not saying, "I will kill you all." It was saying, "This is what I am. Come and be worth it." Kira moved first, because Kira had been the best for 90 years. And the best didn't wait for permission. She came in low and fast at 60 kilometers per hour, with the liquid grace of a vampire who had been fighting things that moved faster than humans since before most of the countries on this continent existed. And the predator met her with the combistic, and the engagement became something that Selene watched with the specific attention of someone archiving every detail. Because what was happening on the ridge in the gray pre-dawn light of the Carpathian Mountains was unlike anything that had happened in this world before. The Lycans hit from the right 7 seconds in. Marius committing the pack in the coordinated surge that was the defining tactical expression of Lycan pack doctrine. 400 pounds each, multiple vectors. The kind of assault that had broken vampire formations for 4 centuries. The predator had the net launcher tracking before they cleared the tree line, and Barak went down in filament that contracted under supernatural strength in ways that suggested the material had been specifically engineered to do exactly that. The plasma caster discharged twice, controlled bursts, she noted, not the full discharge that had vaporized Soren's tree in the initial encounter. Controlled, because it wasn't trying to end this quickly. It was fighting at the level of its opponents, deliberately, choosing the engagement duration and intensity with the same cold intelligence that had governed every decision it had made since landing. This was not a demonstration of what it could do. This was what it looked like when the predator decided that the prey was worth the full experience of the hunt, and the full experience required that the prey have a genuine chance. Kira hit it from behind while it was managing Marius and 2 Lycans simultaneously, on a strike that connected with the biohelmet and registered visibly. The helmet shifted, the targeting system flickered. The plasma caster lost acquisition for 2 seconds. The predator took the hit, absorbed it, and turned to look at Kira with the amber lenses at close range. And she looked back at it without flinching, and the mandibles spread fully. The ridge was alive with the sound of the most extraordinary combat the Carpathian Mountains had witnessed in 4 centuries of extraordinary combats. And the pre-dawn sky above it was going pale at the eastern edge. And somewhere between the fighting bodies, Selene stood at the tree line and understood, with a clarity that bypassed analysis and arrived as simple recognition, that whatever came after tonight, nothing about it would resemble what had come before. The fight lasted 41 minutes. Selene knew this because she timed it. not from tactical necessity, but because some part of her understood that this was the kind of event that deserved precise documentation, that the specific duration of what was happening on the ridge was data that mattered in ways she couldn't fully articulate yet, but that her instincts, 2 centuries of instincts, calibrated against everything this war had produced, told her were significant. 41 minutes? She had fought Lycans for the better part of 2 centuries, and the longest sustained individual engagement she had personally experienced was 11 minutes before one side broke or died. She had heard of Lycan vampire confrontations that lasted longer, the old stories from the early centuries when the war was newer and both sides were still learning what the other was capable of. But those were stories, and stories had the tendency to extend durations the way they extended everything else that made good telling. This was not a story. This was happening in front of her in the gray Carpathian dawn, and it lasted 41 minutes and nobody broke. The predator took damage. This was the first thing she cataloged with the focused attention she was giving it, because the question of whether it could be hurt had been the foundational tactical question since Soren's patrol, and the answer was now comprehensively established. Kira's strike had shifted the biohelmet and created a targeting disruption that lasted the better part of 3 minutes before the system recalibrated. Marius, in full transformation, had connected twice with the kind of force that moved armored vehicles, and both times the predator had staggered. Not fallen, not retreated, but staggered, thus absorbing impact and redistributing it with a physical resilience that was impressive even by the standards of the supernatural biology she spent her professional life fighting. The net launcher housing on the left gauntlet had been destroyed by a combined Vampire-Lycan strike in the 14th minute. Kira high, Varus low, the coordination between them so instinctive that she doubted either of them had consciously planned it. The coven and the pack were fighting together. She noted this separately, gave it its own category in the mental archive she was building, because 4 centuries of war had a weight and a momentum. And what was happening on the ridge was fighting against both of those things simultaneously and winning, at least for 41 minutes. And 41 minutes was enough to establish that it was possible. The predator gave as comprehensively as it received. Her Barok had been netted and released and netted again, and was currently operating at what she estimated was 60% of full transformation capacity. The filament having done something to his left shoulder that his regeneration was handling, but slowly. 2 of Kira's 4 death dealers were out of the engagement. One with a plasma burn across the torso that had compromised her mobility without stopping her. One with wrist blade damage to the left arm that she was fighting through with the expression of someone who had decided that pain was a data point she was choosing not to prioritize. Marius had taken a combi stick strike in the 23rd minute that had gone through the meat of his right shoulder and come out the other side. And he was fighting with one functional arm, and the complete refusal to acknowledge this. That was either extraordinary professionalism or the specific stubbornness of a Lycan alpha, who understood that the moment he showed limitation was the moment his pack's cohesion fractured. The predator was bleeding, not human blood, something darker, with a copper iron smell that the Carpathian air carried to her position at the tree line, and that the biohelmet's chemical sensors were undoubtedly cataloging as data. The plasma caster housing had a crack in it from the 14th minute combined strike that had taken out the net launcher, and she could see, at vampire visual resolution, which was considerable, that the crack was affecting the weapon's thermal management, requiring more conservative discharge intervals than the predator had been using in the early part of the engagement. And yet, it was still standing, still fighting, still choosing the engagement intensity with that cold, deliberate intelligence, still calibrating the combi stick and the smart disc against the specific capabilities of the specific opponents in front of it, still adapting in real time to the coordinated tactics that the vampires and Lycans were developing together out of necessity and producing with the intuitive efficiency of beings who were, fundamentally, built for this. The 40th minute was when it happened. Kira went for the biohelmet directly. Not a strike, a grab, both hands, using her full vampire strength to attempt to physically remove the helmet from the predator's head, or which was either the most tactically sophisticated thing anyone had done in the engagement, or the most dangerous, depending entirely on how the predator responded to it. The predator stopped moving. Not from the grab, Kira's strength was considerable, but she hadn't broken the helmet's seal. It stopped because it chose to stop, and Selene felt the quality of the stillness from 30 meters away, and understood what it meant before the logical processing had finished assembling the conclusion. The plasma caster powered down. The smart disk decelerated and docked. The combistic retracted to half-length. It let Kira hold the helmet. She held it for 3 seconds. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the sustained physical effort of 40 minutes of combat against something at this level. And the shaking was the honest testimony of a body that had given everything it had and was operating on reserves. She looked at the biohelmet's lenses from a distance of 15 centimeters, and the lenses looked back at her, and neither of them moved. Then she released it and stepped back. The predator straightened to full height. The plasma caster stayed powered down. The combistic retracted fully. It looked at Kira, then at Marius, then at the surviving fighters on both sides, cataloging, assessing, or running the final iteration of a calculation that had been building since the moment it stepped off its ship and saw 2 species of supernatural predators locked in a war that neither side was winning. It reached to the trophy housing on its armor and removed 2 items. The talon from Ersebet's patrol, the preliminary specimen from the hunt's beginning, and set them on the rock face at the center of the ridge. Then it reached higher, to a different housing, and produced 2 new trophies that Selene identified after a moment as taken during the night's engagements. Precise, clean, the kind of evidence gathering that required not just physical capability, but the discipline to conduct it in the middle of active combat. One for the vampire faction, one for the Lycan faction. Not skulls, tokens. The distinction was significant in ways she was still working through. It placed them on the rock and stepped back, and in the gesture was clear enough that it required no translation. Not a gift, not a concession, but an acknowledgement. You were worth it. The hunt is complete. These are the marks of what happened here. Marius looked at the token for a long moment. Then he looked at Kira. Kira looked at the token and then at Marius. And the 4 centuries between them sat in the air and then, fractionally, shifted. Not dissolved. Not resolved. Shifted. The way a weight shifts when it's picked up and examined rather than simply carried. Vadim arrived from the fortress at 5:51 a.m. with 8 death dealers, and the specific expression of a 640-year-old leader who had watched his perimeter defenses go dark and his best fighters commit to an unauthorized engagement, and had decided that arriving after the fact with a show of force was the most productive available response to a situation that had already moved past his ability to shape. He looked at the ridge, and he looked at the Lycans standing 20 meters from his death dealers, and neither side in the process of destroying the other. He looked at the predator at the center of the space, damaged and upright. And then he looked at Selene. She looked back at him with the expression she had developed for conversations where she was not interested in pretending that the person she was speaking to had more operational standing than the situation had left them with. "The capture operation," she said, "is over." Vadim looked at the ridge for a long time, at his wounded death dealers, at the Lycan Alpha with one functional arm, at the tokens on the rock face, at the being that had come from beyond the stars and spent a single night dismantling every assumption that both sides of a 4-century war had built their doctrine around. Yes, he said finally. "I suppose it is." The predator moved to the ridge's edge and looked east, where the sky above the Carpathians was going from pale gray to the specific color that preceded dawn. Not quite pink, not quite gold. The color of a world about to be illuminated, whether it was ready or not. It stood there for a long moment, with the biohelmet's lenses directed at the horizon. And Selene watched it and tried to read the stillness and found, for the first time since the encounter had begun, that she couldn't. Then it turned and walked back down the mountain toward the crash site. Nobody followed, not because they lacked the capability or the curiosity or the lingering tactical rationale that Vadim's operational mind was certainly still generating in the background, but because every person on that ridge understood, in the wordless way that beings understand things they have earned through shared experience, rather than received through instruction, that following was not what this moment called for. Kira picked up the token from the rock, turned it over in her fingers, set it back down. Marius picked up the other one, did not set it back down. The sun broke the eastern horizon, and the Carpathian Mountains went gold. The Carpathian Mountains kept their secrets the way they had always kept them. In stone and silence, and the long patience of things that measured time in geological rather than biological units. What had happened on the ridge above Varhegi on that November night would not appear in any human record, would not be investigated by any authority with the institutional standing to investigate it, would not be discussed in any forum accessible to the species that built the villages 40 kilometers away, and occasionally photographed the atmospheric effects of objects entering the sky at angles that didn't belong to anything they had cataloged. But it would be remembered. The crash scar on the eastern slope healed slowly, the way mountain terrain heals, pine saplings pushing through the debris field by spring, or the rock face weathering back toward uniformity over years that meant nothing to the mountains, and considerable amounts to the creatures who measured their lives against them. The ship was gone before dawn, lifting out of the ravine on drives that left no exhaust signature and no electromagnetic trace, carrying its pilot back toward a sky that had no name in any language spoken at the base of those mountains. What remained was the change. Vadim's capture operation died on the ridge, and with it the specific strategic fantasy of technological advantage through acquisition that had animated the coven's planning for the 3 weeks since the crash. Ilka's cleared examination table stayed cleared. The specimen jar that had existed briefly as a conceptual object in the coven's strategic calculus was never made physical. Vadim was too intelligent and too old to pretend that the night had not demonstrated, comprehensively and without ambiguity, that the creature had been manageable at its own discretion and not at his. And 6 centuries of survival had been built on the bedrock principle of never confusing the two. The Lycan calculation was different in its specifics and identical in its conclusion. Marius kept the token. Verus, in the field report she delivered to the pack 3 days later, described the engagement with the flat precision of a hunter documenting a hunt she had witnessed, and drew conclusions that the pack absorbed in the particular silence of beings updating their understanding of what the world contained. The vampire-Lycan coordination on the ridge had been improvisational and unrepeatable in exactly the form it had taken, born from the specific pressure of a specific night. But improvisation left traces in the people who had done it, and traces had a way of becoming precedents when the conditions were right. Selene stood on the ridge the morning after and looked at the 2 tokens on the rock face and thought about precedents. She had not asked for what had happened here, had not planned it, had not shaped it toward any outcome she had specifically intended when she made the decision to communicate with the creature in the western tree line, rather than fight it or flee from it. The night had moved the way nights moved when genuinely novel forces entered established systems, unpredictably, irreversibly, in directions that the system's existing categories couldn't fully describe. The war between vampires and Lycans was 4 centuries old and had its own momentum, its own institutional architecture, its own deeply personal investments on both sides that no single night could simply dissolve. She understood this. She had lived inside it long enough to understand it from the inside. The way long conflicts became self-sustaining, drawing energy from the very destruction they produced, making peace feel like a kind of defeat to people who had structured their entire identity around the prosecution of the conflict. But the ridge existed now. The 41 minutes existed. The tokens on the rock face existed. Kira had left hers. Marius had not. She picked up Kira's token and turned it over in her fingers. The same gesture Kira had made the night before, she realized, and set it back down. Some things needed to stay where they'd been placed. The predator had come here looking for the most dangerous prey it had ever encountered, and it had found something more complicated than prey. It had found 2 species in the middle of a war so old it had become more habit than intention. And it had done what apex predators do when they encounter a situation that doesn't fit their existing categories. It had adapted. It had assessed. It had made decisions according to a code that had nothing to do with vampire-Lycan politics and everything to do with something older and simpler and, she thought, considerably more honest than the justifications both sides had built around 4 centuries of atrocity. It had not resolved anything. She was clear-eyed about this. The war's causes and grievances were unchanged. The institutional structures that perpetuated it were damaged but not dismantled. Vadim was still Vadim, and Marius was still Marius, and the history between their factions was written in too much blood to be rewritten by a single night on a ridge in the Carpathian Mountains. But the night had happened, and the night had demonstrated something that both sides now carried in their operational memory whether they wanted to or not, that they could fight together, that their combined capabilities produced something neither could produce independently, that the 20 meters between them on the ridge had been crossable under sufficient pressure. Sufficient pressure had a way of returning. She looked east, where the Predator's ship had gone, toward whatever waited beyond the sky that she had never thought to wonder about until tonight. The universe was larger than the war. She had known this intellectually for 2 centuries and understood it, finally, in the way that things are understood when they arrive not as information, but as experience. The tokens stayed on the ridge. The mountains stayed silent. And somewhere in the space between the stars, a Yautja filed its hunt record and marked the destination. Not as conquered, not as exhausted, but as the specific designation that meant worth returning to.